The grand hall of Azathian Prime, seat of the Galactic Empire, exuded an air of arrogant supremacy. Walls of shimmering obsidian reflected the dim, artificial starlight that hung above, casting jagged shadows on a floor inlaid with alien glyphs. The assembled dignitaries, a mix of reptilian, insectoid, and amorphous forms, watched the solitary figure at the hall's center with thinly veiled contempt. Paul Vane stood motionless, his diplomatic robe stark against the sea of alien opulence. The humans had sent a representative, though to what end, no one could fathom. To the Empire, Earth was an insignificant planet, notable only for its stubborn defiance. Paul Vane, High Commander Forgayan, drawled, his voice a guttural rasp that echoed through the chamber. The towering reptilian figure loomed above the human, crimson scales glinting in the light. Your people have sent you here under the pretense of peace. Yet peace is a gift, not a right. Paul inclined his head, his expression calm. His gray eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed none of the tension coursing through his veins. The people of Earth seek coexistence. High Commander, war serves neither of us. Laughter rippled through the room, a chorus of alien tones that bounced off the high ceilings. Forgayan's lips curled into something resembling a smile, revealing rows of jagged teeth. And yet you arrive unarmed, utterly reliant on our goodwill. Tell me, Earthman, is this bravery or foolishness? Paul held his ground, his voice steady. A gesture of trust, nothing more. Forgayan's eyes narrowed. Trust? An amusing concept from a species that fights among itself for scraps. You're here because your leaders understand their place, as subjects, not equals. A flicker of something dangerous passed over Paul's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He allowed himself a faint smile. Perhaps you underestimate us, High Commander. The room fell silent. The Empire's representatives exchanged uneasy glances, their amusement tempered by the humans' quiet confidence. Forgayan, however, seemed unfazed. He rose from his throne, his massive frame casting a long shadow over Paul. Underestimate? Forgayan repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. No, little human. I see you for what you are, a desperate envoy from a desperate world. With a wave of his clawed hand, he signaled the guards flanking the chamber. Take him. Diplomacy has failed. 2 guards, hulking creatures with chitinous armor, approached. Paul remained still, his expression unreadable. As they grabbed his arms, he allowed himself to be led toward the exit, but not before glancing back at Forgayan. Trust is a two-way path, Commander, Paul said, his tone almost conversational. And underestimating an opponent is a dangerous habit. Forgayan sneered, but something in Paul's gaze gave him pause. It was the look of a man who had seen the abyss and stepped into it willingly. The journey to the holding cells was short but oppressive. Paul noted every detail. The placement of cameras, the guards' routines, the subtle shifts in air pressure that hinted at hidden doors. He moved with the compliance of a lamb to slaughter, though his mind worked with the precision of a predator. Once inside the cell, the door slammed shut with a metallic clang and the guards retreated. Paul sat on the cold bench, hands resting on his knees. He exhaled slowly, centering himself. For years, he had trained for this moment, honed to be more than just a diplomat. The covert program that had sculpted him into what he was now had no name, only a purpose. Earth's survival depended not on words but on action, and Paul Vane was action incarnate. He glanced around the cell, his eyes landing on a faint seam in the wall. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest a ventilation shaft. He allowed himself a small smile. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy, deliberate. Forgayan appeared on the other side of the cell bars, flanked by 2 guards. Comfortable? The High Commander asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. Paul met his gaze. As much as one can be in a cage. Forgayan chuckled darkly. You amuse me, human. It's a pity your kind will not survive long enough to entertain us further. Paul leaned forward, his expression neutral, but his tone laced with subtle menace. "You misunderstand, High Commander. I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to deliver a message." Forgain's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Paul leaned back and gestured casually to the walls of his cell. "Do you hear that?" The High Commander frowned, glancing at his guards. "Hear what?" Paul's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Exactly." A sudden hiss filled the air, faint but growing louder. The guards looked around, their movements tense. Before Forgain could issue an order, the lights flickered and died, plunging the corridor into darkness. The last thing Forgain saw before the emergency lights flickered on was Paul Vane, standing perfectly still, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. "Underestimating an opponent," Paul said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "is a dangerous habit indeed." The cell door clicked open. The corridors of the Empire's stronghold stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of cold steel and flickering lights. Paul moved like a shadow, his steps soundless, his movements precise. The emergency lockdown had sealed most doors, but to someone like him, that was a minor inconvenience. Every flicker of light and hum of distant machinery served as a reminder of the Empire's overconfidence in their security. He crouched by a panel in the wall, fingers deftly removing the cover to expose a tangle of alien circuitry. The Empire's technology was leagues ahead of Earth's, but Paul had studied their systems. With a few calculated cuts and twists, he rerouted power to disable a nearby camera. He paused, listening. No footsteps. For now, he was alone. Paul's mind worked as methodically as his hands. He didn't just see corridors and walls. He saw opportunities. Each vent, each access panel, every piece of machinery was a tool or a weapon waiting to be used. The Empire had created a fortress designed to suppress rebellion, but in doing so, they had given him a playground of potential chaos. A distant clang echoed through the halls, followed by the guttural chatter of alien voices. Paul pressed himself against the wall, blending into the shadows. Two guards appeared, their insectoid bodies gleaming under the dim light. They moved with purpose, antennae twitching, their weapons held tightly. Paul watched them pass, noting their gait and the subtle clicks of their armor. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were trackers, elite units trained to hunt and eliminate. He waited until they turned a corner, then followed silently, keeping to the edges of the corridor where the shadows were deepest. As he moved, his thoughts drifted to his training. Earth's covert program hadn't just taught him how to kill. It had taught him how to think like his prey. He understood fear, anticipation, and overconfidence. The Empire's soldiers were skilled, but they relied too heavily on their superior technology and numbers. Paul relied on something far more primal, his ability to adapt. The trackers stopped at an intersection, their heads swiveling as they scanned the area. Paul crouched low, concealed behind a large pipe. He could see the subtle tension in their movements, the way their fingers hovered over their weapons. They knew he was close, but they didn't know where. He waited, his breathing slow and measured. One of the trackers emitted a low clicking sound, a signal to its companion. The second guard nodded and began moving toward Paul's hiding spot. Timing was everything. As the guard passed by the pipe, Paul sprang into action. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the alien's head and twisted sharply. The guard's neck snapped with a sickening crunch, and its body slumped to the floor. The second guard whirled around, raising its weapon, but Paul was already on him. He drove a concealed blade into the alien's thorax, twisting it to ensure a fatal wound. The guard let out a strangled hiss before collapsing beside its companion. Paul stepped back, wiping the blade on his sleeve. His movements were calm, almost clinical. There was no satisfaction in the act, only the cold efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to count. He dragged the bodies into a nearby alcove, ensuring they were out of sight. Then he turned his attention to their weapons. The rifles were sleek and alien, designed for beings with extra appendages. Paul adjusted the grip to suit his hands and tested the weight. It would do. Moving deeper into the stronghold, Paul encountered more signs of heightened security. Doors were sealed with reinforced barriers, and the number of patrols had increased. Forgain was taking no chances. The thought of the High Commander brought a flicker of a smile to Paul's lips. Forgain had underestimated him once. He wouldn't make that mistake again, but it was already too late. Paul approached a control room, its door guarded by 2 sentries. These were different from the trackers, heavier, slower, but undoubtedly more armored. Engaging them directly would be risky. He scanned the area, his eyes landing on a vent above the door. Climbing into the vent was a tight squeeze, but Paul moved with practiced ease. The metal groaned softly under his weight, but the noise was masked by the hum of machinery below. He positioned himself above the guards, peering through the grate. The control room beyond was a treasure trove of information. Screens displayed live feeds of the fortress, troop movements, and even a map of the stronghold. It was exactly what he needed. Paul opened the grate carefully, ensuring it didn't make a sound. He dropped down behind the guards, landing silently. Before they could react, he struck. A swift blow to the base of one guard's skull sent it crumpling to the ground. The second guard turned, but Paul was faster. He drove his blade into the alien's side, piercing a gap in its armor. The room was his. Paul locked the door and turned to the console. The alien script was unfamiliar to most, but not to him. He had spent years studying their language, their systems, their culture. He navigated the interface quickly, pulling up schematics and disabling several security measures. As he worked, a notification flashed on one of the screens. Forgain's face appeared, his expression grim. "Attention, all units," the High Commander's voice boomed. "The human has escaped. He is armed and dangerous. Do not underestimate him. Kill on sight." Paul smirked. "Kill on sight," he muttered to himself. "Good luck with that." He downloaded the schematics onto a small device and exited the control room. The halls were quieter now, but the tension was palpable. The Empire's forces were searching for him, but he was already several steps ahead. As he moved toward his next objective, Paul's thoughts lingered on Earth. He remembered the faces of the people he had sworn to protect, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He wasn't a hero. He never had been. But if he could buy Earth more time, more leverage, then perhaps his actions would mean something. A faint noise drew his attention. A whisper of movement down the corridor. He ducked into an alcove, weapon at the ready. A group of soldiers passed by, their heavy boots echoing in the silence. He let them go. For now. Paul continued deeper into the stronghold, his path clear, his mission unwavering. The Empire thought they were hunting him, but they didn't realize the truth. They were already his prey. The tension within the Imperial stronghold had shifted from mere vigilance to outright paranoia. Every corridor felt charged with dread, as if the very walls anticipated the chaos that Paul Vane carried with him. The once mighty fortress of the Galactic Empire now resembled a cage, its occupants trapped alongside the predator they had unwittingly invited. Paul moved with deliberate precision, his stolen rifle slung across his back, and a blade gripped loosely in his hand. His senses were sharp, his mind operating on pure instinct. The map he'd extracted from the control room had guided him here, to the heart of the stronghold, where Forgain's personal quarters and command center were located. The route was heavily fortified. Patrols crisscrossed the corridors in erratic patterns, their movements desperate and uncoordinated. The fear was palpable, and Paul used it to his advantage. His steps were silent as he slipped between shadows, avoiding detection with ease. A trio of soldiers appeared ahead, their conversation barely audible over the hum of the stronghold systems. Paul crouched behind a pillar, observing their movements. They were jittery, their weapons held tightly, their eyes scanning every corner. They weren't looking for a man. They were looking for a phantom. Paul waited for the right moment, then struck. He moved like a blur, dispatching the first soldier with a swift cut to the throat. Before the others could react, he fired a silent shot from his rifle, dropping the second. The third turned, his expression frozen in terror as Paul's blade found its mark. The bodies fell silently, and Paul dragged them into the shadows. He didn't linger. The Empire's forces would find them soon enough, and he needed to stay ahead of the hunt. As he approached the command center, Paul's thoughts turned to Forgain. The High Commander was more than just a symbol of the Empire's cruelty. He was its architect. His conquest of countless worlds had left a trail of devastation, and Earth was meant to be his next prize. Forgain's arrogance had been his downfall. He had seen Paul as a harmless envoy, a weakling to be mocked and discarded. Now, the hunter had become the hunted, and Paul intended to make Forgain understand the true meaning of fear. The command center's entrance loomed ahead, guarded by a pair of towering sentinels. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were biomechanical constructs, their bodies reinforced with cybernetic enhancements. Taking them down would require a different approach. Paul studied their movements, noting the precise timing of their patrol patterns. He spotted a maintenance hatch nearby, partially obscured by a stack of crates. Slipping through the hatch, he found himself in a narrow crawl space that ran parallel to the corridor. The space was cramped, the air thick with the smell of machinery and lubricant. Paul moved quickly, his body contorting to navigate the tight confines. Through the slats in the wall, he could see the sentinels standing motionless, their sensors scanning the corridor. Reaching the end of the crawl space, Paul emerged into a small storage room adjacent to the command center. He located a control panel and began overriding the security systems. The Sentinels were connected to the Stronghold's central network, and Paul exploited their programming. The Sentinels twitched, their movements suddenly erratic. Paul smirked as he watched them turn on each other, their built-in weapons tearing through armor and circuitry. The sounds of their destruction echoed through the corridor, and when it was over, the way was clear. Paul entered the command center, his weapon raised. The room was vast, dominated by a massive holographic display that projected a map of the galaxy. Forgain stood at the far end, his back turned, his hands clasped behind him. "You've made quite the mess, human," Forgain said, his voice calm but laced with venom. Paul didn't lower his weapon. "You brought this on yourself." Forgain turned slowly, his imposing frame illuminated by the glow of the holographic map. His eyes burned with fury. But there was something else there, too, something that looked suspiciously like respect. "You're resourceful," Forgain admitted. "Clever, even. But you're still just one man. Do you truly believe you can stand against the might of the Empire?" Paul took a step forward, his voice cold. "I don't need to destroy the Empire. I just need to destroy you." Forgain laughed, a deep, guttural sound that filled the room. "You think my death will change anything? You're a fool. The Empire is an idea, a force of nature. Killing me won't stop it." "Maybe not," Paul said, "but it'll send a message." Forgain's expression hardened. "Then come, human. Show me what you're capable of." The High Commander moved with surprising speed, drawing a blade from his side. Paul fired, but Forgain deflected the shot with a flick of his wrist. The two clashed in the center of the room, their movements a blur of steel and determination. Forgain's strength was immense, his blows heavy and precise. Paul countered with agility, using the environment to his advantage. He ducked beneath a swing and rolled across the floor, grabbing a fallen weapon. The battle raged, the room a storm of sparks and shattered equipment. Paul fought with everything he had, but Forgain's cybernetic enhancements gave him an edge. A powerful strike sent Paul crashing into a console, the impact jarring. Forgain loomed over him, his blade raised. "This is the end, human." Paul gritted his teeth, his hand reaching for something on the console. Not yet. He activated the console, triggering an overload in the Stronghold's power grid. Alarms blared, and the room was bathed in red light as energy surged through the systems. Forgain staggered, his implant sparking and failing. Paul seized the opportunity, lunging forward and driving his blade into Forgain's chest. The High Commander gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief as he collapsed to the floor. Paul stood over him, breathing heavily. "The Empire will fall," he said, his voice steady. "And it starts with you." Forgain's body went still, the light fading from his eyes. The alarms continued to blare, and Paul knew his time was running out. He grabbed the data chip from the console, a record of the Empire's operations, and slipped out of the room. The stronghold was descending into chaos, soldiers scrambling to contain the power surges. Paul moved quickly, his path clear. He had done what he came to do, but the mission wasn't over yet. As he reached an escape pod, Paul allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had struck a blow against the Empire, but the fight was far from over. The pod launched into the void of space, leaving the crumbling stronghold behind. Paul stared out at the stars, his expression unreadable. Somewhere out there, Earth was waiting, and so was the Empire. The escape pod hummed as it hurtled through the void, the stars blurring into streaks of light through the viewport. Paul Vane sat rigid in the cramped cockpit, his body battered, but his resolve unbroken. The chip clutched in his gloved hand pulsed faintly with the secrets it carried. An entire galaxy's worth of intelligence condensed into a tiny fragment of data. Earth's survival hinged on it. Paul's mind raced as he recalibrated the pod's trajectory, his fingers flying over the alien controls. Forgain was dead, and the Imperial stronghold lay in ruins, but victory was far from assured. The Empire would respond with a vengeance. He needed to get the data back to Earth before they caught wind of his escape. An alarm blared, jolting him from his thoughts. The pod shuddered violently as a tractor beam latched onto it, pulling it out of its trajectory. Paul cursed under his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon strapped to his side. A massive Imperial cruiser loomed ahead, its shadow swallowing the pod whole. The docking clamps engaged with a resounding clang, and the pod's door hissed open. Paul stood, weapon at the ready, his muscles coiled like a spring. The corridor beyond was eerily silent, the air thick with tension. Stepping out of the pod, Paul scanned his surroundings. The cruiser's design was sleek and menacing, its walls lined with glowing conduits that pulsed like veins. The silence was unnerving. He expected guards and ambush anything. But the corridor was empty, save for the hum of the ship's systems. A voice crackled through the ship's intercom, deep and resonant. "Paul Vane, you've proven yourself resourceful, but your journey ends here. Surrender the chip, and you may yet live." Paul smirked, his grip tightening on his weapon. "You'll have to do better than that." The intercom went silent, but the walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with each step Paul took. He knew he was being watched, every move analyzed and calculated. Rounding a corner, he came face to face with a squad of Imperial soldiers. Their weapons were trained on him, their stances rigid. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Paul dove behind a bulkhead as the corridor lit up with blaster fire. The heat of the shots singed the air around him, but he remained calm, methodical. Popping out from cover, he fired a volley of precise shots, each one finding its mark. The soldiers fell one by one, their cries drowned out by the sound of weapons discharging. The last soldier lunged at him, wielding a blade. Paul sidestepped the attack, twisting the weapon out of the soldier's grip and driving it into his chest. The body crumpled to the floor and Paul pressed on, his focus unshaken. The voice returned, colder now. "Impressive, but you can't outrun us forever, Paul. You're one man against an empire." Paul didn't respond. He moved deeper into the ship, his goal clear. The bridge was the nerve center of the cruiser, and he intended to take control. The journey was a gauntlet of traps and ambushes, each one more ruthless than the last. Automated turrets sprang to life, forcing Paul to dive and roll, his reflexes honed to a razor's edge. Soldiers descended from hidden compartments, their attacks coordinated and relentless. Despite the odds, Paul pushed forward, his determination unyielding. He was battered and bruised, his energy waning, but his will remained strong. Reaching the bridge, he found the door sealed. The control panel glowed with alien symbols, but Paul had seen enough of their technology to know how to override it. His hands worked quickly, bypassing the security protocols as alarms blared around him. The door slid open, revealing the bridge's vast expanse. A dozen officers turned to face him, their expressions a mixture of shock and fear. Paul raised his weapon, his voice steady. "Step away from the controls." The officers hesitated, their eyes darting between him and the imposing figure at the center of the room. A tall man in a black uniform stood there, his presence commanding. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Paul, and he smiled. "You've come a long way, Mr. Vane," the man said, his tone almost admiring. "But this is where it ends. Who are you?" Paul demanded, his weapon trained on the man. "Admiral Cale," he replied, stepping forward. Forgain's second in command. And now, the one who will finish what he started. Cale moved with lightning speed, drawing a blade that shimmered with an unnatural energy. Paul barely had time to react as the Admiral lunged, their weapons clashing in a burst of sparks. The fight was brutal, a test of skill and endurance. Cale was a formidable opponent, his movements precise and calculated. But Paul fought with something the Admiral lacked, a burning need to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The clash of steel echoed through the bridge, the officers too stunned to intervene. Paul gritted his teeth as Cale's blade grazed his arm, but he didn't falter. He countered with a swift strike, his blade cutting through the Admiral's defenses. Cale staggered, blood staining his uniform. His expression twisted with rage as he lunged again, but Paul was ready. He sidestepped the attack and drove his blade into Cale's chest. The Admiral's eyes widened in shock as he collapsed to his knees. Paul stepped back, breathing heavily, his weapon still raised. Cale looked up at him, a bitter smile on his lips. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped. "The Empire will hunt you down. You can't stop us." Paul stared at him, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not, but I can slow you down." With a swift motion, he turned to the control panel and inserted the chip. The data began to upload, broadcasting its contents to every corner of the galaxy. The Empire's secrets, their strategies, their weaknesses, all exposed. Alarms blared as the ship's systems went into overdrive. Paul moved quickly, setting the cruiser's reactors to overload. He glanced at the officers, their faces pale with fear. Get to the escape pods. Now, they didn't need to be told twice. As the bridge emptied, Paul made his way to an escape pod. The ship trembled violently, the reactors on the verge of a catastrophic meltdown. He launched the pod just as the cruiser exploded in a blinding flash, the shockwave rocking the small vessel. Drifting through the void, Paul watched the flames fade into the darkness. He had dealt a crippling blow to the Empire, but he knew the fight was far from over. Earth was waiting, and so was the war.